In November of 1965, the first major battle of the Vietnam War would commence, setting the precedent for the lasting scars that the war would leave on both Vietnam and the United States of America. Fought in the Chu Pong Massif mountain complex within the Central Highlands, the United States military were lifted into a sprawling complex of forests, hills, and generally inaccessible terrain, which, combined with the determination and tactics of their adversary, would make this an extremely difficult fight. To work around the odds that were so seemingly stacked against them, the United States utilized the famous helicopter air assaults that would become so synonymous with the Vietnam War, as well as heavy artillery shelling. On the opposite side was the People's Army of Vietnam, who were familiar with the difficult peaks and valleys which they would be fighting in. They utilized close quarters combat, with soldiers on the ground aiming to neutralize the heavy firepower brought in by the United States. What would become known as the Battle of Drang was an extremely important conflict, and a bloody beginning to what would soon become one of the most memorable wars in United States history. Both sides suffered heavy losses, and a precedent was set for the strategies that would be utilized by the Americans and the Vietnamese for the remainder of the war. But why did the Battle of Drang happen in the first place? And how did it play out when it did? Today, we will bring you a documentary that aims to tackle these questions and more. We will take a look at the key figures behind each army, and examine how both the United States military and the People's Army of Vietnam utilized their strategies in an attempt to overpower the other. Sit back and relax as we talk you through the Battle of Drang, America's first major battle of the Vietnam War. But first, a huge thank you to Supremacy Call of War 1942 for sponsoring this video. It's a free online PvP grand strategy game where you take command of a real nation during World War II and fight for global dominance against as many as 99 other players in real time, across matches that can last weeks as strategy unfolds day by day. You'll manage the economy, command vast armies from tanks and artillery to fighter aircraft and even top-secret tech like nuclear weapons, and decide whether to forge alliances through diplomacy or to conquer your rivals by force. Your decisions will shape the world. It's available on PC and mobile, so you can continue the war effort wherever you go. And just in time for this video, the developers have rolled out a Marines update, introducing elite amphibious troops designed for rapid coastal assaults, island hopping operations, and stealthy shoreline insertions that can change the tide of war in the early game. If you use the link below, you'll get an exclusive starter pack worth $25, including loot boxes which can unlock the brand new Marines, an elite amphibious unit with fast coastal assaults and unique stealth upgrades, available only for the next 30 days. So if you love military history, strategy, and exploring alternate timelines for how World War II could have unfolded, click the link in the description and download Supremacy Call of War 1942 for free, and lead your nation to victory. Thanks again to Supremacy for supporting our channel and helping to keep these important wartime stories alive. This is Wars of the World. While the Vietnam War is generally accepted to have begun in November of 1955, major United States involvement would not commence for the best part of a decade. Its roots can be found in the First Indochina War, which saw Vietnamese forces fighting for an independent Vietnam, which at the time was owned by France as a colony. Initially in the 1950s, the United States became involved with Vietnam to assist the French in their combat efforts, providing aid and military advice. In 1954, the French withdrew, which, following the Geneva Accord, saw Vietnam split into two halves: the Communist North and the non-Communist American-backed South. Elections were scheduled for 1956 that would attempt to reunify the country, but the United States, fearing the spread of communism, made a play to stop them, and blocked the elections from going ahead. American leaders believed in the domino theory, the idea that if one nation, being Vietnam, were to fall to communism, then other nations of Southeast Asia would soon follow suit. For nearly 10 years, fighting would be carried out on a relatively small scale between the troops of North and South Vietnam. America took a back seat on the operation as corruption and instability began to grow rife in the South. It soon became apparent that if they wished to halt the spread of communism that they were so sure would arise in Vietnam if it was left alone, a greater degree of involvement was required. After the costly Korean War, Presidents Eisenhower and Kennedy were reluctant to commit a large-scale war in Asia, but Lyndon B. Johnson, elected in 1961, was willing to test his luck. In the summer of 1965, Johnson began building up United States forces in the Central Highlands of Vietnam, northeast of the Saigon region. The Viet Cong, supported by the People's Army of Vietnam, had begun to establish a major presence in South Vietnamese countryside, where there were few roads in or out of the area. This made the highlands a perfect place for the Viet Cong to form their bases, and to amass a presence that could be used to cut South Vietnam in two from the southwest. They had formed what became known as the B-3 Front, a large force of Viet Cong soldiers from the 32nd, 33rd and 66th Regiments, led by Major General Chu Huy Mun. The general had planned to target South Vietnamese forces in the provinces of Kon Tum and Pleiku, the latter being the location of the South Vietnamese 2nd Corps headquarters. As the Central Highlands were so inaccessible by land vehicle, the United States military decided to take their chances to test a new approach: air mobility tactics. These would deliver battalion-sized forces to and from their planned area of battle using helicopters, reinforced by air support, rocket fire and artillery shelling. By July of 1965, the 1st Air Mobile Cavalry Division, or Air Cavalry, had been deployed into Camp Radcliffe in the South Vietnamese town of An Khê. Over the course of the next few months, preparations will be put in place for a full-scale assault on Viet Cong forces, and by November, the fighting will be just around the corner. The Americans' planning of the assault on Viet Cong forces had been halted. Their presence in the Central Highlands had attracted the B-3 Front's attention, and they actually attempted to attack a smaller, secondary camp, US Army Special Forces Plei My Camp, in October 1965. The Plei My Camp had been set up around 45 kilometers southwest of Pleiku, where North Vietnamese forces will be attempting to wrestle control of valuable positions from the south. The plan was to have the 33rd Regiment attack the camp, while the 32nd Regiment lay in waiting, overpowering any relief that would be sent to the Americans from Pleiku. The Americans, however, were ready. The Viet Cong's initial attack was pushed back quickly with air support. The Viet Cong had been hit hard enough that American relief troops could join them safely, and while the 32nd Regiment did attack the Americans as they arrived, the relief forces were able to repel them too. Following the foiled assault on the Plei Mi camp, the Americans turned their attention to putting together a plan that would stop the B-3 front from claiming land in Pleiku province. General William Childs Westmoreland, who commanded United States forces across much of the Vietnam War, appointed General Harry Kirkland to start making plans for an offensive. Kirkland's 1st Brigade began establishing a presence in the Pleiku regions of the Central Highlands, and they captured a People's Army of Vietnam aid station, recovering intel that the B-3 front will be joined by the 66th Regiment any day now. These initial efforts to understand the area were not without risk, and after suffering casualties in their initial skirmishes in Pleiku province, the United States 1st Brigade was replaced by the 3rd. Further intelligence would provide the positions of 3 North Vietnamese regiments by the 11th of November. They were stationed in the foothills of the Chu Pong Massif, a mountain range in the southern Central Highlands. On the 12th of November 1965, the orders were given for the 1st Air Mobile Cavalry Division to prepare for a massive air assault. The Battle of Ya Drang would soon be underway. Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore was chosen to select landing zones for lifting United States soldiers into the Ya Drang Valley, near to the spot where the B-3 front soldiers had been gathering. He was told that there should be no attempt made to scale the mountains, and as such selected a series of flat, low-lying clearings surrounded by short trees. Of the 7 zones he selected, Landing Zone X-Ray would be the most prominent, located towards the eastern foothills of the Chu Pong Massif. The plan was to bring in soldiers to the landing points where artillery support was launched from a nearby fire support base, FSB Falcon, roughly 8 kilometers northeast of Landing Zone X-Ray. X-Ray was chosen as it was believed that the People's Army of Vietnam lacked anti-aircraft guns and heavy mortars. They had been destroyed when they attempted to attack the Plei Mi camp. Selecting to land here would allow US troops to get very close to the Viet Cong without running the risk of being shot down. Altogether, around 1,000 United States cavalry troops, as well as 900 supporting troops from the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, will be airlifted into the Battle of Ya Drang Valley. In addition, the Americans would have artillery and mortars at their disposal, as well as the assistance of aircraft and helicopter support units that would be able to provide fire upon request. On the 14th of November 1965, the 1st Air Mobile Cavalry Division began airlifting in the cavalry units, one by one, dropping them at Landing Zone X-Ray around every 30 minutes. Moore took up a centre of command around the middle of Landing Zone X-Ray. The B-3 front, on the other hand, are believed to have been around 2,500 strong, with ground forces exceptionally skilled at fighting in close quarters. The question now was, how would this battle play out? Around 10 minutes before 11 AM on the 14th of November 1965, troops from the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry were lifted in to Landing Zone X-Ray. As they landed, a massive barrage of rockets and artillery fire bombarded the Viet Cong position around the Central Highlands, which proved to be useful in 2 ways. Firstly, the soldiers were able to land safely without the impending threat of enemy fire. And secondly, a B-3 field front that had departed to secretly attack the Plei Mi camp once again were forced to postpone and opted to fight the Americans near to the landing zone instead. Captain John Herron's B Company, as well as Moore's 1st Battalion, had landed at X-Ray and opted to stay near to the centre of the zone, while smaller groups were sent out to the surrounding areas to scout for enemy threats. Eventually, B Company were ordered to move west, who were able to intercept and capture a People's Army of Vietnam deserter. The deserter freely revealed information on the 3 regiments that were stationed near the Chu Pong Massif, including numbers of soldiers and details on their weaponry. While this was taking place, additional units from the United States 1st Battalion had arrived at Landing Zone X-Ray, with the rest of B Company and 2 platoons from A Company. A Company reconvened and stationed themselves to the left of most of B Company, along the bed of the creek that ran through Landing Zone X-Ray, ready to intercept enemies who would now likely be heading their way. The first shots of the battle were fired around 12:15 PM and came from a nearby jungle where 3 platoons of B Company had been patrolling. The Viet Cong had intercepted these soldiers, and they suffered a series of casualties. Moreover, they had been pinned down in the jungle well away from the centre of Landing Zone X-Ray. Lieutenant Henry Herrick, in charge of 2nd Platoon, who was desperately attempting to hold his position, radioed in to inform those at the landing zone just what was happening. They were taking fire from the flank on their right, but they were still attempting to pursue and eliminate the Viet Cong who were trying to attack them. Herrick's platoon was, however, soon spread out around 50 meters and became separated from the other 2. As Herrick radioed in once more, asking whether he should enter or circumvent the clearing containing the Viet Cong, a firefight broke out. His men did not suffer any casualties, but seemed to inflict heavy losses on the enemy. The firefight alerted additional Viet Cong around the platoon, who began to close in around them. Attempting to reunite with the men of the 1st Battalion, situated near the landing zone, Herrick took his men to a defensive knoll in the middle of the clearing. But it was too late. 5 men from the platoon, including Herrick himself, would lose their lives in just 25 minutes. Herrick radioed to his captain, informing him he had been hit, and artillery fire was arranged for the spot he had gone down. When Herrick died, his command was passed to Sergeant Ernie Savage, who had picked up his radio. By the time the artillery fire had arrived, another 3 men had been killed, and 13 were wounded. Under Savage, however, the platoon were able to hold their own at the knoll for the duration of the battle. Wave after wave of Viet Cong charged at the men held up in the clearing, some of them even without their guns. The defensive position that had been reached by Herrick was enough to see the remaining men through, however, and they were eventually able to make it back to safety at the end of the battle, amidst a terrible scene of destruction and death. Back at the landing zone, remaining soldiers from A and B Company attempted to set up a perimeter that would make it hard for Viet Cong to breach. At 1:30 in the afternoon, they were joined by soldiers from C Company, working under Captain Bob Edwards, who stationed themselves along the south and southwest of the landing zone, facing towards the mountains. C Company's first act was to call in airstrikes along the face of the mountain, to give those establishing a perimeter some time. Around the same time that C Company had arrived, one of the 3 platoons that had been patrolling in the jungle when they became separated from Herrick, 3rd Platoon, led by Lieutenant Bob Taft, encountered more enemies. 150 People's Army of Vietnam soldiers, to be exact. They had been following the creek towards the landing zone, where they had come face to face with 3rd Platoon. American soldiers were ordered to move forward for an assault, which proved to be particularly costly. The front line was cut down quickly, and they were forced to pull back as Lieutenant Taft lost his life. Command was passed to Sergeant Lorenzo Nathan, who managed to stop the Viet Cong from advancing down the creek bed towards the landing zone. A Company's 2nd Platoon, led by Lieutenant Walter Marm, flanked the enemy as they fought Nathan's men. Marm and his troops were able to cut down around 80 North Vietnamese fighters, who subsequently scattered, allowing the Americans to recover those who had died in the initial skirmish. These initial battles, as bloody as they were, did not deter the Viet Cong from launching massive assaults on A, C, and eventually D Company when they arrived. The People's Army of Vietnam had begun to breach the landing zone, and fire was pouring in as the final helicopters arrived at around 2:30 p.m. As between 175 to 200 Viet Congs assaulted the perimeter, C Company requested heavy ordnance support, which obliterated huge numbers of the enemy. Many Viet Cong were burned to death while they attempted to flee the bunkers around the perimeter, running headfirst into a line of artillery fire. In just half an hour, the Viet Cong scrambled once more and regrouped at the mountain. While C Company fought off the enemy at the landing zone, A and D Companies were facing problems of their own. A second assault had been launched along the creek bed, and the Viet Cong were attempting to cut into the perimeter to separate them from C Company. At close range, the Americans began providing heavy fire as the North Vietnamese soldiers began to pour in. Terrified soldiers manning machine guns fought off wave after wave of enemies, facing increasing numbers of casualties. By 3:20 p.m, the last of the soldiers of the 1st Battalion had arrived. A, B, C, and now D Company were fully deployed, with all of their associated weaponry and men. The perimeter was reinforced, and mortar fire was focused on the assault on A and D Companies. As the Viet Cong withdrew from the area, attention turned towards making another push to rescue the 2nd Platoon of B Company, who were stranded at the defensive knoll in the clearing, facing heavy enemy fire. Among the troops pinning them to the knoll was an entrenched machine gun positioned on a tall termite hill, preventing them from escaping. Lieutenant Marm of A Company took out the gunner with anti-tank fire, alongside a small barrage of grenades. He personally killed the remaining Viet Cong with his rifle, and had been wounded in the neck and jaw in the process. Marm and his men almost managed to rescue the lost platoon, but were cut off before they could reach them, when more soldiers poured in from the woods. By this point, it was starting to get dark, and fighting would be near enough impossible with the ferocity the Viet Cong had exhibited throughout the day. The Americans held their position throughout the night, and were placed on full alert. They faced probing efforts from the enemy across the evening, but opted to hold their fire, as to not reveal their location to the wider People's Army of Vietnam, who were continuing to amass in the hills. It had been truly a brutal day of fighting, but one that was now coming to a close. As dawn approached, more requested recon patrols to be sent out into the surrounding forests and hills to search for any impending Viet Cong threat. C Company's scouts only made it 150 yards outside of their perimeter before they were met by enemy troops, and a firefight broke out. 200 People's Army of Vietnam soldiers burst from the trees running towards the perimeter, and focused their fire on C Company's 1st and 2nd platoons, both of which suffered massive casualties. This was then followed by an attack on the 3rd platoon under Lieutenant William Franklin, and a number of their men were seriously wounded in the assault. It soon became apparent that the Viet Cong were attempting to surround them from multiple directions, but the American forces pressed on, and were able to drop hundreds of North Vietnamese attackers as they attempted to breach the perimeter. The fighting seemed to be particularly intense along C Company's southern line. As it reached a boiling point, Moore issued a command to Lieutenant Charlie W. Hastings to transmit a code phrase, "Broken Arrow." This would relay to any available support in South Vietnam that an American combat unit was in great danger of being overrun by the enemy. Just as he called for support, C Company's lines were broken, and many Americans lay dead. Troops from the People's Army of Vietnam slowly weaved in and out of their bodies, killing those that were alive but wounded, and claiming the weapons from their corpses. Air fire support soon arrived, but Moore's command post would be struck with friendly fire, as two F-100 Super Sabre jet fighters dropped napalm charges dangerously close to American positions. Hastings radioed in to order them to change course, and they did so, but the damage was already done. Several Americans had been wounded or killed by the napalm, and a terrible scene emerged as soldiers were dragged to aid stations, all while receiving fire from the Viet Cong. The intensity of the fighting led Moore to call for reinforcements, who came in the form of the 2nd Battalion, 5th Cavalry, who had previously landed at Landing Zone Victor, not far from Landing Zone X-Ray, but one with a much lesser Viet Cong presence. As the reinforcements arrived, the Viet Cong began to withdraw from the scene, but continued to launch small skirmishes and harassing fire to the Americans stationed at Landing Zone X-Ray. Upon arriving at the scene, the 2nd Battalion was startled to see just how much death had occurred there. American and Vietnamese bodies could be seen strewn across the site, riddled with bullets or locked in combat, in the very moments they had died. Soon efforts will be put in place to withdraw the 1st Battalion 7th Cavalry from Landing Zone X-Ray. The 2nd Battalion 7th Cavalry and 2nd Battalion 5th Cavalry would theoretically be able to continue the fight where they left off. They were withdrawn the following day. Before Moore's 1st Battalion were withdrawn from the battlefield, however, he instigated one last attempt to rescue the 2nd Platoon of B Company from the knoll in the clearing. Soldiers from both battalions made their way to B Company's location, where they did not encounter any Viet Cong. 9 men had been killed and a further 13 were wounded. Those who had survived were carried back to Landing Zone X-Ray to be evacuated under a small amount of sniper fire. By the evening, the men had been extracted from the knoll, and following a series of carpet bombings that were launched on the People's Army of Vietnam's positions, the Americans dug in once again, fortifying their perimeter as night began to fall. Throughout the night of the 15th of November, X-Ray was probed once more by the Viet Cong. Before dawn, a large-scale fight broke out, but was quashed by 2nd Battalion 7th Cavalry's B Company in a matter of minutes. Artillery strikes from Lieutenant B. Lund are believed to have been a major factor in the success of this encounter. Without them, the Americans may have been overrun in the night, with low visibility and with the element of surprise tilted in the enemy's favour. Fighting continued into the early hours of the morning, focused primarily on B Company, but airstrikes and rifle fire continued to suppress the enemy. In this second skirmish, not a single American was killed. The 1st Battalion 7th Cavalry withdrew from their position at around 10:30 am on the morning of the 16th of November. The battle at this site was over, but another at Landing Zone Albany would soon be beginning. On the 17th of November, the 2 remaining battalions marched from Landing Zone X-Ray to new landing zones. The 5th Cavalry headed to Landing Zone Columbus to the northeast, while the 7th marched to Landing Zone Albany further to the north. The Americans aimed to bomb the slopes of the Chupong Massif, where the remaining soldiers of the People's Army of Vietnam were stationed, and so moving soldiers to these new zones would help them to avoid any friendly fire. By mid-morning they had moved out, but something was amiss. A reconnaissance mission near Landing Zone Albany had revealed footprints, bamboo arrows, and grains of rice on the ground. 5th Cavalry's A Company had discovered grass huts, which they were ordered to burn. There was plainly a bigger Viet Cong presence here than the Americans believed, and suddenly they were on extremely high alert. Eventually, they stopped to rest in a clearing, having overpowered a small team of Viet Cong reconnaissance troops. As they questioned their prisoners, additional Vietnamese voices could be heard speaking from within the tall grass behind them. Lieutenant Pat Payne of the 5th Cavalry's A Company had led his platoon less than 200 yards from the headquarters of the People's Army of Vietnam's 33rd Regiment. Hundreds of Viet Cong were now encroaching on their position. They were trapped in an ambush. Soldiers from the People's Army of Vietnam's 33rd and 66th Regiments soon emerged from the tall grass at around 1:15 p.m. The ensuing fight would last for a terrifying 16 hours, as the Viet Cong spread along the eastern flank of their position. Piece by piece, soldiers from the Vietnamese forces would branch off from the main group, attempting to overpower the Americans in hand-to-hand combat. Some Americans managed to find shelter in a cluster of trees amidst a series of tall termite hills, where they could begin providing mortar and artillery fire support to those lower down. Meanwhile, Americans who had already reached Landing Zone Albany began providing suppressing sniper fire, particularly at those who had exited the tall grass and were wandering around the landing zone's exterior. Meanwhile, Viet Cong, who maintained their position within the grass, searched for hiding American soldiers, picking them off one by one. With more soldiers being brought into the battle, the ambush platoon's chances of survival increased, but the death toll was catastrophic across the board. A and C companies had lost 70 men in the first few minutes of them having joined the battle. American hope came in the form of napalm bombs dropped by USAF A-1E Sky Raiders, but due to the uncertainty caused by the fog of war and the close quarters combat, these may have killed both Viet Cong soldiers and American troops. Around the time the bombs were dropped, the only high-ranking officer to be killed on either side, Ly Xuan Phuoc of the People's Army of Vietnam, was killed. The wounded began to be evacuated from the Landing Zone Albany site later that afternoon, when elements of the cavalry from the 1st Battalion came to the 2nd Battalion's aid. With sufficient air support, this allowed the men left on the ground to make advances against the remaining Viet Cong. By the late afternoon, reinforcements had been called in from Captain Myron de Durik's B Company from the 2nd Battalion's 7th Cavalry. Troops were deployed directly into the tall grass and were able to pick off the Viet Cong that remained within, as helicopters provided intense ground fire. This was enough to rout the Viet Cong's forces, and the Americans were able to dig in for the night once more. The Battle of Ya Drang came to a close on the 18th of November, as the remaining Viet Cong took off into the surrounding hills and jungles. American forces spent 2 whole days gathering their dead and identifying the bodies. Corpses were scattered all across the battlefield, in what was described as being similar to a, quote, long bloody traffic accident in the jungle. 155 men were killed or missing in the ambush at Landing Zone Albany, and American soldiers subsequently departed for the nearby landing zone Crooks. Around 237 United States soldiers are believed to have been killed across both Landing Zone X-Ray and the ambush at Landing Zone Albany, with an additional 258 being wounded and 4 being missing. The supporting South Vietnamese forces assisting the Americans are believed to have lost 132 men, with 248 being wounded and 18 being missing. The United States claim to have killed between 1,000 and 1,800 Viet Cong during this battle, but the People's Army of Vietnam noted that 554 were killed and 669 being wounded. Click the link below to download Call of War 1942 for free and claim your exclusive starter pack worth $25, including loot boxes that can unlock the brand new Marines unit. Offer available only for the next 30 days. So enlist now and lead your nation to victory.